Figuring things out. Good morning. I'm going to just pray here to get started, and then I'll start into my message. Thank you, Jesus, for this time that we can come together. I just pray that I could be a vessel used by you this morning to honor you, and that the words I say are beneficial, but that I'm speaking your truth, and that people can hear your word and your truth through what I share this morning. I just pray that I can be open to your leading. So thank you for everything that you give us, and I just pray this in Jesus' name. So I want to start out with a bit of a story here in the beginning, and it is a little bit of a spin off of the story from the Bible. So feel free to go and read the story from the Old Testament. It's about where the Israelites had sinned. They'd come into, or they were going through a time again of falling away, and Jesus, or God, gave them a serpent to hold up. And so there was all these snakes that were released, and the people that were being bitten by them were dying. And there was a serpent lifted up, or they were told to make a pole to lift up and to hold up in the middle of the group of people so that they could look at the snake. And what I want to talk about this morning is I want to commit to being one of the people helping hold that pole up. And I do not want to be trying to be Jesus. I think we know that story points towards Jesus and is an example of what Jesus offers for our sin. And so I want to make a commitment of being a person that in my brokenness and in my shortcomings, I am willing to be part of helping hold Jesus up, hold that pole up with the snake, so that the people around me, and kind of what I got a picture of this morning as I was thinking about this when I got this idea, is that we're in a battle and we're all taking we're getting wounded, we're in the midst of being hurt by life or being hurt by the things around us. And so what I want to commit to is being a part of the standing alongside, standing behind, or just being willing to lift someone else up or help in any way of being able to make sure that I'm not lifting myself up as Jesus, and that people are able to see Jesus because of what I'm helping do. So I hope that makes sense, but I just really got that clear story of what Jesus offers this morning, of an introduction to this walking in the Spirit. I feel like this is such a big conversation. There's so many different ways you can go with it. So to go into the introduction here, I had asked for some feedback earlier, and so I kind of just want to go over a few things that people sent back and some conversation. There was quite a bit of conversation around this, but one of the things, so feedback on walking in the Spirit, confidence doing things in faith, not fear of man. And I think these are pretty self-explanatory, so I'll just kind of go over them here. Walking in the truth taught by Jesus, walking in the light and controlling one's actions, and fulfilling the teachings of Jesus. And then I feel like the one on the end here of having visions and having a controversial message, referring to Peter's vision, is one that it's very easy to get sidetracked on on disagreements of how we come out on that. But if we focus on the story of what happened to Peter and how he was led to a different style, a different group of people to reach out to because of how God spoke to him. And God spoke to him in a way that he understood from, his experiences, what God meant. So I definitely appreciate the feedback and just people weighing in on what they feel like. And again, I feel like this is a big enough conversation. We can have a lot of conversation, or I'm saying conversation a lot. We can have a lot of talks and different ways that we go with this. So yeah, I definitely don't want to come across like I have all the answers on this. I'm just covering the material that I kind of have been working on here, and I've really enjoyed this time of being able to go over this. And this is I think it's just a really practical way of learning better how we can love Jesus. So before I go into the next slide, I wanted to read I have this written in my notes for my Pure Desire class about a definition of shame. And so I just want to read this. So, partial truth of getting borderline lust. So the context is like with my addiction to pornography. I think I've talked about that before. So this is like getting borderline lust out of something that is not really porn, but it's okay. But when I'm honest about it, I'm still getting the rush and getting as close as possible to it without, sinning, or that's what I'm trying to tell myself. And what I'm trying to say or talk about is how me living out of my flesh contrasts so much to me living out of what Jesus wants me to live in. And so then to go on with that shame and feeling shame for flirting with sin and going closer than planned to lust and separation from God, not being willing to be completely honest about everything and keep it hidden, being deceptive in how I share about it, and then feeling the separation, knowing the truth, but not having the courage to be honest. And so that, to me, that really defined in a way that I lived out of my flesh. And I hope that makes sense. I hope I said that in a way that I think it'll make a little more sense once I read the Bible verses here too. So the verses I'm using today are out of Galatians, and I just wanted to say before I start on this whole chapter, Galatians 5, is really good, and I feel like it just speaks, the whole chapter speaks into this conversation. And I've just really been kind of taken aback of how practical this chapter is to this question or this conversation about walking in the Spirit. But I'm going to start in verse 16 of Galatians 5. I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lusts of the flesh. For the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary to one another, so that you do not do the things that you wish. But if you are led by the Spirit, But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Now the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousy, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions and heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like, of which I tell you beforehand, just as I have also told you in time past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. And then in contrast to that, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. And those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. And let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. I feel like that lays out. It starts out with that contrast and then gives very practical differences between what it looks like to live out of me living out of my flesh, or what it would look like for me to be living in the Spirit. And then something I wanted to point out, I think it comes up a little later in my notes too, is that the walking in the Spirit that it talks about takes action. And a lot of those fruits of the Spirit take action. It's not just about saying the right thing, or I think that kind of speaks for itself. Of walking that out is really, really what we're talking about. And so that leads to a relationship with Jesus, I feel like, is underlying this whole discussion. And that was something that I wanted to definitely point out. I'll read this quote. An unbeliever cannot truly imitate Jesus. If one attempts to do so, it will be a sham. No one can become a Christian by imitating Jesus. Salvation is only by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. But if you are a Christian, you can and must imitate him in the power of the Holy Spirit. And so I really appreciated this quote, because I feel like it really contrasts, again, in my own strength, in me trying to pull myself up by my own bootstraps. I am gonna fall short, and it's gonna look fishy. It's gonna look that it'll be a sham. I really liked how this again laid out the contrast. Then this goes into what is the difference about me because of Jesus, is something that I feel like I have this conversation quite often with others and people around me, and like, how has my life changed? What do I do different because Jesus is part of my life? And I know one of the things is definitely living in victory versus in bondage. And I feel like then how I live that out is just really dependent on how much I understand my relationship with Jesus, which goes into the next question. Walking out of truly believing what Jesus says about me is something that how aware or how important is it to me what Jesus says about me, and how much do I take that literally? So this next slide, if you have a pencil and can just jot down the references, these are paraphrases, and how you choose to interpret the verse is up to you. I just really wanted to give these as ideas to make us think about this concept of what Jesus says about me. John 15:15 says, I'm a friend of his. John 15:16 says, I'm chosen and appointed. Romans 3:24, I'm justified freely by his grace. Romans 6:6, no longer a slave of sin. Romans 8:1 and 2, no longer condemned, and free from sin and death. And then Romans 8:11, I am adopted by a daddy. I am joint heirs of Jesus and will be glorified with him. 1 Corinthians 6:17, I have the same spirit as Jesus. And this is each one of these could be a message in themselves of talking about what does it mean to be a friend? What does it mean? All these different aspects of even our personal life, or what does my relationship with Jesus mean to me? How important is that to me, and how much am I willing to make that a real part of my life? I feel like it can really, that I'm adopted by a daddy, I'm joint heirs with Jesus. There's different ones of these that are just really meaningful to me, but the intimacy that is portrayed in some of these verses it's so real that I almost like to use daddy as something that it portrays such an intimate relationship. And that really is what we're talking about, is getting to, do I really see Jesus as my daddy? Am I able to have that emotional response? Am I able to really let that sink in of who Jesus is to me, of how much, we talk about how much he sacrificed, how much he was willing to give. But like, I've been thinking of, Jesus wasn't messing around. When he said, I commit, he gave his life, he gave everything. And so for him to say daddy, for him to say I'm joint heirs, it's not a light thing for him. It's real. And he is speaking out of, I've done my part. I made the commitment. And I know for me, commitment is such a hard thing. Even sharing that story at the beginning, and I know, I really hope that story made sense. And I encourage any of you to talk to me more if you want to know more about kind of what I was trying to portray. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but I really want that concept to come across in what I'm sharing here, of like, the more I understand the reality of what Jesus did and how far he was willing to go, it's hard for me to make a commitment. I struggle with commitment. And so for me, just like I said, even some of the emotions that come up with saying daddy and some of these more intimate terms, how willing am I to really allow Jesus to have that spot in my life? I feel like I kind of covered some of these already. What does it look like to walk in the Spirit? A personal, intimate relationship with Jesus. I feel like that's kind of what I was just talking about. And believing in God's promises, especially in temptation, that have led to sin. Actually, before I get to that, a personal, intimate relationship with Jesus, there was one other story that I did want to share in that personal, intimate part. So I know I've told stories about off the street in Chicago, and doing street work or evangelism, working on the street, and that my dad and I forget how old I was the first time that I went to Chicago with Dad. I think 11 or 12. I'd have to look back. But I feel like that was a really just an important time in our year, an important part of our relationship, and has been over the years. So that's just to give a little context there to that. And I just remember a conversation that a gentleman was having with Dad and I. He found out that Dad was my father, and that Dad was a Christian, and then I'm a Christian. And like, so we got into this conversation, and it was really, he was making a point of how important it was for me as the son that my father had this relationship to pass down to me. And, you know, in a way that felt like, in the way he was presenting it, that without that, I wouldn't have had the chance to have that relationship. And something that I just want to make really clear, I cannot change the relationship I have with my father. I unapologetically have a really good relationship with my dad, and I love him so much. And he's done so much for me. And I've told stories about that before. But that does not make him someone that would replace Jesus. And if I get that out of context, if I forget that, that relationship can actually become an idol to me. And so what I'm pointing out here is I really want to stress, this is a personal relationship. And yes, I'm so thankful for my relationship with my father, but I understand not everyone has that. And so I'm just wanting to say this, it's important to understand that Jesus died for me. It's important for me to understand that when Jesus makes a promise, he's talking about, it's not because of some expectations you're trying to fill for someone else in your life. It's because I died for you. I made these sacrifices for you, Jeremy. This is personal to you. And that other relationships in your life are different in their importance in comparison to the relationship with Jesus. So that was something I wanted to point out. And then going on to that believing in God's promises, especially in temptation that have led to sin before. The context for this was, or an example, I'll just say an example that came to mind because of this, is in my work, I'll get into shops or basements or places where people have graphic pictures on the wall. And I don't think we have to imagine too much what that might look like. And with my past in pornography, this is something that coming into situations like that, sometimes even unaware that I'm walking into that situation, it can feel like I'm already sinning by just being in that situation. And sometimes going back to that thing I read on shame earlier, it can really trigger those responses. And I can start to have doubt. And like, even after 4 years of not being in that bondage, of not living in that, it can really start to feel like I don't have the victory right now. And so what I want to stress about this is I feel like it's important for us to understand in those vulnerable moments is, I'll probably start crying here a little bit, but is where Jesus really wants us to know, no, this is what it's about. This is where I love you the most. This is why I died for you, because I knew you couldn't do this by yourself. And so I'm wanting to show you that you can have victory. And it's especially in these moments that I want you to hear that. And I feel like that's such an important part of this whole discussion of like me even partially wrapping my head around what that means goes so far in realizing, wait, if it's without Jesus, I read that quote earlier, if I'm trying to do this on my own strength, if I'm trying to do this without Jesus' help, I will fail. And that is not what Jesus wants. That isn't his vision for the relationship. He's excited, he's committed, and he's in it because he wants to show us a different way to live. So then going further with this concept, it's not a concept, like what Jesus calls us to, loving and serving sacrificially in the midst of that, and something that came up for me, or that I thought about right away, is the example of Jesus washing Judas's feet after, when we know he knew that Judas was going to betray him. And again, I know there's a lot of tangents that we can get lost on some of these conversations, but I feel like the important part with this is Jesus knew what Judas was going to do. It wasn't he had part of the information where maybe he wasn't. Like, he knew, and he chose with that knowledge to serve. And that is such a foreign concept to me. I'm like, if I'm going to serve, it's so easy for me to go, man, I want something out of this. I want to have some recognition. I want to have maybe just a wave or a nod. Like, I see you there. I see what you did. Jesus isn't getting any of this from Judas. Jesus got pure, unadulterated betrayal from this guy. And he chose, knowing that, to serve him. And I think the important part here is that we go in with the knowledge. It isn't about doing it because we're trying to live up to someone's standard for us or try to fulfill something that somebody is putting on us. It's that I personally understand this person does not have my best interest in mind, and I'm choosing to go serve them in that knowledge. And that's really hard. And I'm saying I'm not going to always do that, right? I'm just not. It's such a hard concept, such a hard thing to do, to walk out. And then this goes into the walking in the Spirit. I mentioned a little earlier of like those actions, walking actions in the Spirit produce fruit of the Spirit. So in that serving, in the fruit of the Spirit, in those things coming out of my life, if I'm not doing it for the right reason, again, back to that quote, it really is going to show up as not sincere at all. But when I'm doing it for the right reasons, the fruit of the Spirit are real, and they are going to be obvious. They're going to be something that, hey, I can tell that person is living in a different way. I know from what I see them doing and how I see them responding to situations, they have something different. They are different because of their walk. And sometimes people might not even know if they're, maybe they don't know I'm a Christian or I haven't said that. They just know there's a difference. This is another thing where the working on the street is something where Dad has this thing. And I feel like for Dad, it's easier. But he'll say a block or half a block away, he'll sometimes even name the school that they're from, because there's Moody and there's Christian schools in Chicago. And he'll even sometimes just in his mind say, I bet this group of young people coming is from Moody or from, and he'll call that. And not that he calls it out to them, but he knows it. There's a connection before he even starts a conversation, before, like, just in their faces, he sees a difference. And I feel like that's such an important thing, again, to get our minds wrapped around, is that when we're walking in the Spirit, when we're doing this, when we're doing the action, people are going to notice. People are going to be able to tell the difference. And we are human. We do make mistakes. I'm not trying to paint this imperfect picture of the fact that there's humanness mixed in this, and sometimes that comes through louder than the fruit. And I feel like it's at times like that where we have to be open to receiving correction. We have to be willing to really be able to hear from God as he speaks to us what it means to live out the fruit of the Spirit, or what it means to have these qualities in our life that we're responding to. Something that I wanted to talk about a little bit is that kind of came to mind as I was thinking about this message this morning was how a team works. And I think what kind of got me thinking about it is Liz and I have some favorite movies that tell this story of underdog sports teams where maybe they're based in an inner city or they're somewhere where they might not have the credits, they might not be able to get the best players, they're an underdog team. And then through coaching, this team will be given confidence, and a coach will come alongside them and speak life into that team. And obviously I'm making from this, I want the example to be the church of how, as we allow ourselves to be coached, as we allow ourselves to better understand what Jesus means when he says the promises that I read over, when he makes those promises to us, as we better understand that, and as we work together in our areas of living in the fruits of the Spirit or out of the fruits of the Spirit, that coming together is such a beautiful thing of us working together. And in the sports illustration, there's all kinds of different ways that you can kind of talk about that and the different things coaching can do, because there can be bad coaching, and there's plenty of conversations that you can have about that. But I feel like the idea I wanted to get from it is someone who thinks they're always going to lose. If I have the concept, because of the way I grew up or because of the situation I came out of, that I'm never going to win, I'm always going to lose at life, I'm not going to be open. And you see some of the breakdown in the coaching with the sports reference of, if I truly believe I'm going to lose, it affects how I play. And so what I wanted to say out of that is, as we look at church and as we look at this whole conversation, am I looking at what Jesus promises in the victory and the fruits of the Spirit and what it would look like and how it would look and how I would live differently if I believed what Jesus says, and how that would affect my actions? And how would that help the church, and how would that help in loving and serving each other as we're all trying to do that with the goal in mind of being more like Jesus, of what we're looking for, what we're looking forward to or looking up to in the snake story. Jesus is the example that we're trying to set our standard by, not the people around us, not, whatever. Again, there's plenty of ways to break that down. What I really want to come across is the more that we understand Jesus' love for us, the more that we are in tune with that, as much as we can understand it, the more we're going to be able to live this out. And I think that is the notes that I have. I am open to whatever response.
Okay, we are back and just wanted to share a couple comments here. I'm just reading this from the WhatsApp. I don't know if that's what these guys intended, but I'll do it anyways. Lance said a couple things that stood out to me: believing what Jesus says about me, and number 2, having confidence and not believing that I'll fail. And he says, thanks, Jeremy. Enos says, thanks, Jeremy. I had to think how Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, yet was victorious as he was walking in the Spirit. Jesus in the wilderness there, and how he walked in the Spirit as well. Tim Troyer, thanks, Jeremy, for sharing. I appreciate the thought how walking in the Spirit requires action and the emphasis on a relationship with Jesus, even in the difficult times when we would want to push away from him, how he desires to draw close to us. Really good point, Tim. I resonate with that. Clark shares, I so appreciate the concept that walking in the Spirit is walking with Jesus. You hear teaching that puts walking in the Spirit into some mystical, hard to attain experience. That's from Clark. I want to say Jeremy's right next to me, so this is kind of weird. I can't figure out how to make our camera widescreen because I cropped it down. Just a reminder about how intrinsically emotional the relationship between a father and a son is supposed to be. And that's the metaphor that God uses with us. And Jeremy, you talked about using Jesus, Abba Father. There, we get really close. We can see both of us. And we should embrace that, not in an artificial way. So much of my spiritual experience feels like it's performance based. It's like, I need to do this so people will know I have a spiritual experience. And that's not what Jeremy talked about. But at the same time, to find emotional ways of connecting with God, not in mystical ways like Clark said, but real ways. I hope Jude doesn't have a mystical relationship with me. He's looking at me as if he has no idea what I'm talking about. So thank you. Brad says, thanks, that was great. Thumbs up emoji. And Elf says, thanks, Jeremy. Lissa, do you want to just share a little bit? She's going to share, but not her face. But she probably didn't want me to say she wasn't going to share her face.
So I was yelling around in the kitchen getting lunch ready, and Drew said, you should share that. I was telling Jeremy, I like the message because so often when we hear the concept of walking in the Spirit, for many of us, we get this like high in the sky, hard to attain to idea. And Jeremy just tied it back to understanding what Jesus has done for us. And that takes care of what walking in the Spirit is. And I really appreciated that.
Do you have anything else to add, Jeremy?
Thanks for the feedback. I definitely appreciate everyone that shared. And thanks again for the prayers. I don't know if I said that earlier, but it really meant a lot to just get a few texts and hey, we're praying for you through the week, a couple weeks, I guess, as I prepared for this. So yeah, I really appreciate the input and just that feeling of knowing that I have your support and that you're praying. That meant a lot.